If you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories. And if you've been listening for a while and you haven't left a review on Spotify yet, I would genuinely love it if you took 10 seconds to do that tonight. Okay, let's go somewhere quiet, somewhere strange, somewhere that might change the way you think about disappearing. There is a particular kind of silence that only happens on phone calls. Not the silence when someone puts you on hold. Not the comfortable quiet of a call with someone you love where you've simply run out of things to say. This is the other kind. The sudden kind. The kind where one moment there is a voice, familiar, calm, present, and the next moment there is nothing. Just static. Just the ambient hiss of a line still technically open, carrying no information at all. Most of us have experienced a dropped call. We know the feeling. We pull the phone from our ear, look at the screen, see the call has ended, and we dial back. Simple. Frustrating at most. But what if you dialed back and nothing answered? What if you kept dialing all night and eventually emergency services began searching, and they searched for days and weeks and months and years and still nothing answered? What if the voice was simply gone? Not dead, not injured, not hiding, just gone. That is what happened on May 14th, 2008 in the flat open farmland of southwestern Minnesota, when a 19-year-old college student named Brandon Swanson said two words, two ordinary, alarmed, utterly human words, and then stepped out of the world. His body was never recovered. No explanation was ever confirmed. No theory was ever proven. The case remains one of the most haunting and scientifically anomalous missing person cases in modern American history. And tonight we are going to follow two threads at once. The thread of what happened to Brandon Swanson, and the thread of a physicist named Elias Verne, who was quietly monitoring something in that same region of the country that same night. Something his instruments detected and his mind could not explain. Something that, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, does not just challenge how we think about disappearances, it challenges how we think about the nature of the space we occupy. Get comfortable. The story takes a while to build, but I promise you, it goes somewhere you have never been before. Brandon Swanson grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, a small city of about 13,000 people in Lyon County, in the southwestern corner of the state. If you have ever driven through that part of Minnesota, you know what it looks like. Long flat stretches of farmland, wide open sky, roads that cut through fields in perfectly straight lines for miles and miles, interrupted occasionally by grain elevators or water towers, or the geometric outlines of small towns visible from a distance long before you reach them. It is quiet country, honest country. The kind of place where people know their neighbours, where college kids come home on weekends, where a late-night drive on a county road feels about as dangerous as a walk to the mailbox. That is the context. That is the baseline. And it matters. Because part of what makes this case so difficult to accept, part of what keeps it lodged in the minds of everyone who reads it and thinks about it carefully, is precisely how ordinary the setting was. This was not a dangerous environment. This was not a place that swallowed people. This was the kind of unremarkable American landscape where the most dramatic thing that typically happens in a year is a tractor fire or a bad blizzard. The drama of what happened there on the night of May 14th, 2008 does not belong to the setting. It belongs entirely to whatever interrupted a 19-year-old boy's walk home. Lyon County sits at roughly 44 degrees north latitude on a sweep of glacially flattened land that stretches from the Minnesota River Valley westward toward South Dakota. The county seat is Marshall, built around the infrastructure of a mid-sized agricultural processing centre, grain storage, food manufacturing, the practical economic skeleton of a farming region. It is not glamorous, it is not mysterious, it is functional and familiar and deeply, genuinely ordinary. The kind of place that exists in thousands of iterations across the American Midwest, and where the land itself feels like a known quantity. Something you can read at a glance, something that holds no surprises. Brandon was 19 years old and a student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 25 miles northeast of Marshall. He was, by every account from everyone who knew him, A normal young man. Not troubled, not reckless, not the kind of person whose disappearance you would have predicted. He liked the outdoors. He was close with his family. He was studying, figuring out his life, doing all the ordinary things that 19-year-olds do in small Midwestern towns in the spring of 2008. On the night of May 13th going into May 14th, he attended a party near Canby. The party wound down and Brandon decided to drive home. It was late, somewhere in the late evening hours sliding toward midnight. The route home was familiar. The roads were empty. There was nothing about the drive that should have been remarkable in any way. But then his car went off the road. He veered, possibly avoiding something, possibly drifting with tiredness, possibly just misjudging a curve in the dark. And his car ended up in a ditch on the side of a county road. He was not injured. The car was not badly damaged. He was simply stuck, sitting in a ditch in the dark a few miles from where he needed to be, with his phone in his hand and a decision to make. He called his parents. Annette and Brandon Swanson were at home in Marshall when the call came in. Their son's voice was calm. He explained what had happened. He had gone off the road. He was fine. The car was stuck. He told them roughly where he thought he was. He said he was going to start walking toward town and that he would call them when he got there so they could come pick him up. It was a reasonable plan. A mature plan even. He was not panicking. He was not asking to be rescued from the ditch. He was simply managing a minor inconvenience, the way you do when you are 19 and capable, and you do not want to make things more complicated than they need to be. So he started walking, and he stayed on the phone with his parents the entire time. This is the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this case. Brandon Swanson did not hang up and call back later. He kept the line open. For nearly 47 minutes his parents could hear him breathing, hear the distant sound of his footsteps on gravel, hear his voice as he described what he was seeing, hear the ordinary ambient sounds of a quiet Minnesota night in May, wind, crickets, the occasional distant sound of something across the flat land. 47 minutes. Think about what 47 minutes feels like on the phone with someone you love when something slightly worrying has happened. You're not frightened exactly. He told you he was fine, but you are alert. You are present. You're listening to every modulation of tone, every slight change in the quality of the sound, every pause, as a source of information about whether things are still fine. You're conducting a continuous unconscious assessment. You're being a parent. Brian and Annette Swanson did this for 47 minutes. They listened to their son walk. They heard his footsteps. They heard him breathe. They heard the wind of a Minnesota spring night. They heard him say, at one point, that he could see the lights of what he thought was a town up ahead. They heard him orient himself, reason through the geography, figure out where he was. They heard, in other words, a normal young man doing a normal thing, navigating a minor inconvenience with the casual competence of someone who's been taking care of himself for years, and then they heard 2 words, and then they heard nothing. During that time, he told his parents that he could see the lights of a town ahead of him. He was walking toward it. He was certain he knew roughly where he was. He sounded by every account completely normal. A little tired, maybe. A little annoyed at the inconvenience of the night. But fine. Present. Alive. His parents stayed on the line with him because that is what you do when your child is walking alone on a dark road in the middle of the night. You stay connected. You keep the thread of communication alive. You listen for the moment when things are okay so you can exhale. They were still waiting to exhale when it happened. Mid-sentence, mid-stride, mid-everything. Brandon said 2 words. Oh, shit. And the line went dead. Let's sit with those 2 words for a moment, because they matter enormously, and they have been analysed and discussed and theorised about for over 15 years now, and they still resist easy interpretation. Oh shit is not a scream. It is not a cry of pain. It is not the sound of someone who has been grabbed or struck or who has fallen badly and is reacting to injury. It is the sound of sudden recognition, of seeing something, of understanding something in an instant that you did not understand the instant before. Think about when you say those words. You say them when you realise you left your keys inside. You say them when you see a car running a red light. You say them when you look up from your phone and realise the bus is pulling away. You say them at the precise moment between awareness and consequence, when you see what is happening but you have not yet had time to react to it. Linguists who have been asked about the phrase in the context of this case point to something specific about its construction. The O precedes the profanity, which suggests the speaker has a fraction of a second of pure perception before the verbal processing kicks in. The O is not a word, it is a sound. It is the vocal system producing noise before language has assembled itself around the experience, and then shit, the word that channels the response into something communicable, something the brain can label even without fully understanding what it is labeling. In other words, he saw something. He had time to begin forming a response. He had time to produce two sounds, one involuntary and one chosen, and then whatever was happening had progressed too far for anything else to follow. Brandon Swanson saw something. In those last 1 or 2 seconds before the call ended, something entered his field of vision, or his awareness, or his understanding, and it was enough to produce that specific human response. And then there was nothing. His parents called back immediately, repeatedly. There was no answer. They called emergency services. Search and rescue teams were deployed. They searched through the night, through the next day, through the days that followed. Law enforcement combed the fields and ditches and waterways of the area. Volunteers joined the search. The grid was expanded. Every logical place a person could go, every ditch, every body of water, every culvert and field and tree line, was examined. They found footprints. A short trail of footprints in the soft earth near a road, heading in one direction. And then the footprints stopped. Not at a road, not at the edge of water, not at any logical terminus. They simply stopped, the way a sentence stops when the page runs out. No Brandon, no body, no blood, no clothing, no evidence of a struggle, no signs of any external force having acted upon him. He was walking, and then he wasn't, and the ground remembered his last steps and nothing more. In the months and years that followed, investigators considered every conventional explanation. He could have fallen into a body of water, but the water was searched extensively, and bodies do not simply vanish in still Midwestern waterways. He could have been struck by a vehicle, but there was no physical evidence of impact, no reports, no witnesses. He could have wandered disoriented for some distance and collapsed somewhere unsearched, but the search radius expanded dramatically and still found nothing. He could have theoretically left voluntarily, but everything about the call, about the voice, about the footprints, about his relationship with his family argues powerfully against that. The search operation in the days immediately following his disappearance was substantial. Local law enforcement was joined by state resources. Search and rescue teams deployed. Aerial searches were conducted over the flat farmland. Areas that, from above, should yield almost no hiding places, because the land is so open and so unobstructed that a person lying in a field would be visible from a helicopter in daylight. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The Yellow Medicine River, which runs through that part of the county, was searched repeatedly. Every culvert, every depression in the land, every drainage ditch, every stand of trees, all of it was examined. Nothing. No scent trail the dogs could follow beyond a short distance. No disturbance in the water. No clothing caught on. Vegetation. No indication that a body had passed through any of the terrain the searchers covered. It was as though Brandon Swanson had been walking through that landscape and then had simply stopped occupying it. Not fallen, not hidden, not carried away. Just stopped being there, in the way that a sound stops when you turn off the source. Clean. Complete. Without remainder. The geographic confusion in the case added another layer of difficulty. Brandon had told his parents he could see the lights of a town, but the town he thought he was walking toward may not have been the town he was actually near. The flat, open terrain of southwestern Minnesota can make distances and directions deceptive at night. Lights that appear close may be miles away, and the geometry of the landscape can produce optical effects that confuse even people who know the area well. Investigators were not entirely certain, even based on the phone call content and the location of his vehicle, exactly which roads or fields he had walked through during those 47 minutes. The search grid was built on imperfect information, covering an area that might or might not have included every place he actually went. This is not a criticism of the searchers. They worked with what they had. They searched as thoroughly as the information allowed. The difficulty is precisely the point. The incomplete geography of the search is one more element in a case that refuses to resolve into a coherent picture, where every piece of information that might narrow the possibilities seems instead to widen them. His family never gave up. His parents pushed for a law to be passed, and succeeded. The Brandon Swanson Missing Persons Notification Law was signed in Minnesota in 2009, requiring law enforcement to immediately enter information about missing adults into national databases, rather than waiting the arbitrary 24 to 72 hours that had been standard practice. It was a meaningful, real-world change born from grief and determination. But it did not bring Brandon home. His case continued to be reviewed, reopened, revisited. Tips came in and were followed up on. The case received periodic media attention. True crime researchers dug into it. Forums debated it. Every few years the story resurfaced, and every time it resurfaced the answer was the same. Nothing. No remains, no explanation, no resolution. Just a phone call, just a ditch in the dark, just footprints that end, just 2 words. Now we shift threads. Now we go somewhere else entirely, to a different kind of room, a different kind of mind, a different kind of problem. Because while the search for Brandon Swanson was beginning to reveal how profound and complete his disappearance truly was, something else was happening in the world of theoretical physics that most people were not paying attention to at all. In 2008, the study of gravitational anomalies and localized field distortion was still considered a fringe discipline. Not quite pseudoscience. The mathematics were legitimate, the physics were grounded in established theory, but not yet the kind of work that received substantial mainstream funding or institutional support. It sat in the space between what we know and what we suspect, between measurable reality and theoretical possibility. A small number of researchers were working in this space. One of them, and here we use a name constructed for the purposes of protecting real identities and ongoing research, was a man we will call Dr. Elias Verne. He was a theoretical physicist with a background in electromagnetic field theory and what he called spatial boundary modelling, essentially the mathematical study of whether the fabric of space itself could, under specific and extraordinarily rare conditions, behave in ways that standard physics does not currently predict. He was working quietly, with modest funding, at a research institution in the upper Midwest. He had developed, over several years, a network of low-frequency sensors deployed across a wide geographic area, sensors designed to detect the kinds of subtle, low-amplitude signals that standard seismic and atmospheric monitoring equipment would ignore or filter out as noise. His sensors were looking for something specific, something theoretical, something that, at the time, most of his colleagues considered unlikely to exist at all. He called them localized spatial distortions. To understand why Verne was taken seriously by even the small number of colleagues who engaged with his work, it helps to understand the institutional context in which he was operating. The mid-2000s were a period of renewed theoretical interest in the deep structure of space-time, driven in part by ongoing work at particle accelerators, in part by increasingly sophisticated gravitational wave detection technology, and in part by a growing body of mathematical work suggesting that the smoothness and continuity we attribute to space at the human scale might be a large-scale approximation of something considerably more textured and complex at finer resolutions. The idea that space might have structure, might have granularity, might have features invisible at our observational scale, but detectable with sufficiently sensitive instruments, was not a fringe idea in 2008. It was a serious area of theoretical inquiry. Verne was working at the practical end of this inquiry. He was not a pure theorist. He was, in his own words, an instrumentalist, someone whose primary interest was in building the tools that might allow theoretical predictions to be tested against the world. His sensor network was that tool, and the specific prediction he was trying to test was, in the precise language of his work, whether brief, self-limiting instabilities in the local space-time metric could be produced by constructive interference between naturally occurring electromagnetic, seismic, and gravitational perturbation signals, and if so, whether those instabilities would leave a detectable electromagnetic signature in the extremely low frequency range that his sensors were calibrated to capture. In plain language, he thought that under very specific conditions the world could briefly malfunction, and he thought he had built something that could hear it happen. To understand what Werner was looking for, it helps to think about space itself for a moment. Not outer space, but the space in this room, the space between you and the wall, the space that your body occupies as you lie here listening. We experience space as a constant, as something neutral and passive. We move through it without friction. It is, in our daily lives, completely invisible and completely predictable. You reach for a glass of water and your hand travels through the space between you and the glass without incident every single time. Space does not interfere. Space does not behave. But the mathematics of general relativity, Einstein's framework for understanding gravity and space-time, tell us that space is not truly passive. It is a fabric. It can be curved by mass. It can be stretched by gravity. The presence of large objects, planets, stars, black holes, warps the space around them in measurable, documentable ways. We have observed this. We have confirmed it. It is not a theory in the colloquial sense of an educated guess. It is a well-established physical fact. What Verne was exploring was a much more subtle extension of this idea. His question was essentially this: if large-scale gravitational objects can produce large-scale distortions in space, what happens at the microscale? What happens in regions where very specific combinations of electromagnetic interference, low-frequency vibration, and gravitational flux intersect in ways that are brief and highly localized? Could the fabric of space, under such conditions, experience something like a momentary instability? A fold? A seam? Not a wormhole in the science fiction sense, not a portal with edges and a destination. Something far more subtle and far more disturbing. A brief failure of spatial continuity. A moment in which the usual rules that govern the behaviour of matter moving through space simply do not apply. In which a person walking from point A toward point B might, without any warning, without any physical sensation, without any visible boundary, step into a region of space where the coordinates no longer connect to the ones they just left, in which they would simply be elsewhere, or more precisely, in which the concept of where would momentarily cease to function. This was the theoretical territory Verne was exploring, and his sensor network was his attempt to find empirical evidence that such events, if they occurred at all, were detectable. On the night of May 13th, going into May 14th, 2008, Verne's sensor network recorded something unusual. Most nights the readings were routine: background electromagnetic noise, occasional seismic microtremors, atmospheric variations, the ordinary hum of the physical world going about its business in the dark. Verne had processed thousands of hours of this kind of data. He knew what routine looked like. He knew what noise looked like. What appeared in his data stream that night did not look like either of those things. At a specific timestamp in the late evening hours, sensors in a cluster covering a stretch of southwestern Minnesota recorded a brief, intense, highly localized anomaly. It lasted less than 2 seconds. It involved a simultaneous spike in electromagnetic interference, a measurable deviation in gravitational readings, tiny but present and clearly distinct from background, and a signal pattern that Verne would later describe as resembling the mathematical signature of a rapid, localized change in spatial geometry. The event was brief enough that any single sensor might have logged it as noise and filtered it out, but it hit multiple sensors at once. It had a clear spatial centre, a point of origin in the physical landscape from which the readings radiated outward in a pattern that was symmetrical and coherent. And that point of origin, when Verne mapped it onto a geographic coordinate system, placed it within a few miles of where a 19-year-old college student had veered off a county road and begun walking toward the lights of a distant town. Verne did not know this at the time. He did not yet know Brandon Swanson's name. He only knew that his instruments had detected something real, something that matched the theoretical signature of the phenomenon he had been searching for, and that it had happened in a specific place, at a specific time, and that he now had a responsibility to understand what it meant. He reviewed the data repeatedly over the following days and weeks. He ran it through every analytical filter he had. He checked it against seismic databases. No seismic event. He checked it against weather records. No lightning, no atmospheric disturbance. Nothing that could account for it. He checked it against records of human electrical infrastructure, power line fluctuations, industrial activity, communications equipment, and found no match. The signal remained unexplained by any conventional category of physical event. He began building what he called a reconstruction, a detailed mathematical model of what would have to be true about the physical conditions in that location at that time in order to produce the readings his sensors had captured. The model was complex, iterative, and deeply technical. But its conclusion, when he finally arrived at it, was simple enough to state in plain language. Something had happened to the spatial geometry of a small, specific area of southwestern Minnesota for approximately 1.7 seconds. Something that, according to the model, would have been invisible to any observer not equipped with his specialized sensors. Something that would have left no physical mark on the landscape. Something that, from the outside, would have looked like absolutely nothing at all. And something that, from the inside, from the perspective of any matter that happened to be present within that specific location at that specific moment, would have been completely disorienting, possibly instantaneous, possibly in a sense that Verne struggled to put into language even in his private notes, irreversible. This was the point at which he came across the news report about a missing young man in Minnesota. The details of Brandon Swanson's case struck Verne with what he later described as an almost physical force. The sudden end to communication, the lack of any physical evidence, the footprints that ended, the absence of any logical explanation involving the physical landscape, the timestamp of the disappearance, which when Verne compared it to the timestamp of his sensor anomaly, matched not approximately, not within a window of a few hours, but exactly. The last phone call ended, and the sensor spike occurred at the same time. He sat with this information for a long time. He was a scientist. He understood the difference between correlation and causation. He understood that two events occurring simultaneously did not, by themselves, establish a connection between them. He understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that what he was contemplating was, by any standard, an extraordinary claim. But he also understood his data. He understood his model. He understood that the theoretical framework he had been developing predicted exactly this kind of event. Brief, localized, undetectable by conventional means, leaving no physical trace, and that his sensors had apparently captured exactly this kind of event, at exactly the time and location that a person had inexplicably ceased to exist in the world. He began to construct a formal hypothesis. He called it, in his private notes, a localized dimensional slip event. The terminology was his own, chosen carefully to distinguish it from the wormhole and portal language of science fiction, which carried connotations that he felt were misleading. He was not describing a passage between worlds in any romantic or fantastical sense. He was describing something far more mundane and far more terrifying. A brief failure of spatial continuity, a moment in which the coordinates of a small patch of physical space temporarily ceased to be connected to the surrounding coordinate system. A fold, or a gap, or a seam. He used all three words at different points in his notes, dissatisfied with each of them, because none of them quite captured the reality he was trying to describe. The English language had not developed vocabulary for this. The physics had only barely developed the mathematics. What it meant in practical terms was this. A person walking through that location at that moment would have passed from one set of spatial coordinates to another without any subjective experience of transition. No doorway, no sensation, no visual indicator. One step, you are here. The next step, the concept of here, no longer applies in any way that connects you to the place you are standing. And then the event collapses, the fold closes, the seam heals, the spatial geometry returns to normal, and you are simply no longer where you were, not dead, not injured, not anywhere that can be located by a search team combing through Minnesota fields with flashlights. Somewhere else, or someone else, or nowhere, in the sense that nowhere becomes the only accurate description of a set of coordinates that does not connect to any other set of coordinates we can access. Verne wrote extensively about what that last moment would have looked like from Brandon's perspective, or rather, about the one moment before it, which is the moment represented by those two words. Oh, shit! In Verne's reconstruction, a localized dimensional slip event would not be entirely invisible up close, not in the way that it would be invisible from a distance or to monitoring equipment not designed to detect it. At very close range, within a few meters of the event center, there might be subtle visual and perceptual disturbances. The air might appear slightly wrong. The perspective might shift in a way that the human visual system would register as anomalous, without being able to name what it was seeing. The space ahead might look, for just a fraction of a second, as though it did not quite line up with itself, like a seam in a photograph, like the edge where two images that do not quite match have been placed against each other. Brandon Swanson was walking through open farm country at night. He was talking to his parents. He was paying attention to the lights of the town he thought he could see in the distance. He was not, presumably, expecting anything unusual about the next few steps of ground in front of him. And then, in Verne's reconstruction, something about that ground looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not in a way that would take time to process or describe. Just wrong enough, in just the right way, to produce a specific and very human response. Oh shit. Not fear, not pain, recognition. The recognition of something unexpected in the fraction of a second before you can do anything about it. The recognition that is, in a very particular way, the last fully conscious thought before the world changes. And then he stepped forward, or the event reached him, or the geometry shifted around him, and the line went dead because there was no longer a Brandon Swanson on this side of wherever the fold deposited whatever it received. Verne completed his formal report and submitted it through the appropriate academic and private research channels. He was careful. He was meticulous. He included all of his sensor data, all of his modelling, all of his theoretical framework. He was not making wild claims. He was presenting evidence and a hypothesis derived from that evidence in the manner that scientists are supposed to present such things. The initial response was silence, not the silence of dismissal. He had experienced that before, and it had its own texture. This was a different kind of silence. The silence of a communication that has been received but not yet responded to. The silence of something being read by people who are not sure what to do with it. Several weeks passed. Then things began to change in ways that were subtle at first and less subtle later. His access to certain federal atmospheric monitoring databases, access he had held for years as part of his standard research protocols, was quietly revoked. No explanation was given. The access simply stopped working, and when he inquired about it, the responses he received were vague and bureaucratic and ultimately unhelpful. His research funding, which came through a small number of private and institutional sources, began to dry up. Grant applications that would previously have received at least pro forma consideration began to be returned unreviewed. Renewal requests were declined without detailed explanation. The money, without which the sensor network could not be maintained, began to disappear. Colleagues who had previously engaged with his work, not enthusiastically perhaps, but with the collegial willingness to discuss ideas that is the baseline of academic life, stopped responding to his communications. Emails went unreturned. Conference invitations evaporated. The informal network of intellectual exchange that sustains any researcher's work began, quietly and without announcement, to close. Verne noted all of this in his private journals. He was not paranoid by nature, and he resisted the obvious interpretation for as long as he could. Funding cuts happened. Academic relationships cooled. These things did not automatically mean what he feared they might mean. But then the visitors arrived. 2 individuals. He would later describe them in his notes only as professionally dressed, calm, and without affiliation. meaning they presented no identification, offered no institutional connection, and made no claim about who they represented or who had sent them. They arrived at his office. They sat across from him. They were not threatening. They were not overtly intimidating. They were simply there, in the way that certain kinds of official presence makes itself felt, not through coercion, but through implication, through the simple fact of being in the room at all. They told him that he was interpreting incomplete data, not that his data was wrong, not that his model was flawed, not that his hypothesis was implausible. They said specifically and carefully that he was interpreting incomplete data, which is a very different thing, which implies not that he has made a mistake, but that there is more information he does not have access to, and that the people in the room with him do have access to it, and that access has been deliberately withheld. Verne asked what the complete data would show. They did not answer. He asked who they were. They did not answer that either. He asked whether his hypothesis was correct. There was a pause, and then one of them said, in a tone that Verne described as almost apologetic, that was not the right question. They left. He never saw them again. Within weeks, he was gone too. The official account of Verne's disappearance from public life was that he had taken voluntary leave from his institution for personal reasons. There was no investigation. There was no foul play determination because no evidence of foul play was found. There was, in the official record, simply a researcher who had been present and then was not present, for reasons that were personal and private and not anyone else's concern. His research was removed from the databases where it had been indexed. His papers, which had been available through standard academic archives, became inaccessible. Searches for his name in the relevant fields returned results that predated his most significant work, as though the last several years of his career had been carefully edited out of the record. Not deleted entirely, which would have been obvious, just made unfindable, just pushed below the surface when no one would look. His sensor network went dark. The instruments he had placed across hundreds of miles of Midwestern landscape simply stopped transmitting. Whether they had been physically removed or simply deactivated remotely was not something anyone was in a position to determine, and his private journals, the ones in which he had documented everything from his first reading of the anomaly data to the visit from the unnamed individuals, had been partially digitized and partially shared with a small number of people he trusted, in a chain of communication that he had apparently established in the weeks before his disappearance, as though he had anticipated it, as though he had made arrangements. The fragments that survived are not complete. They are pieces of a larger argument, a larger framework, a larger body of work that was clearly not finished when it was interrupted. But they contain enough to understand the direction of where it was going, and that direction is deeply unsettling, because Verne, in his final months of documented work, had gone back through his years of sensor data looking for other events that resembled the anomaly from May 14th, 2008. He was looking for what he called the pattern, the evidence that this had not been a singular, one-time occurrence, but rather a recurring, if rare, phenomenon. Something that happened unpredictably, at intervals that could not be predicted, in locations that could not be predicted, for durations that were always brief. He found them, not many. The events were rare, but they were there, scattered through his years of accumulated data like periods at the ends of sentences that no one had written. Small, definite and unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Anomalies that did not match any conventional physical explanation. Anomalies that matched the mathematical signature of localized dimensional slip events. Anomalies clustered, if you looked at them on a map, in the same general regions where, if you went and looked at the historical record, people had gone missing in ways that resisted conventional explanation. He was careful about this. He was not making the argument that every unexplained disappearance was connected to his anomalies. The world is large and people disappear for many reasons, most of them terrible and human and entirely explicable. He was making a narrower, more specific argument, that a small subset of disappearances, cases characterized by the sudden cessation of communication, the absence of physical evidence, the presence of footprints that ended, the lack of any remains or trace despite extensive search, might represent something that conventional missing person investigation was fundamentally unable to address. He documented 9 additional anomaly events that fell within his sensor network's coverage over the 5 years preceding his work on the Swanson case. 9 events that met his threshold criteria, the specific multi-sensor, multi-signal signature he had come to associate with a localized dimensional slip. He was not willing to claim, without further data, that all 9 corresponded to actual human disappearances. Some might have occurred in uninhabited areas, some might have gone unwitnessed, some might have coincided with disappearances that were never publicly reported or never connected to the geography his sensors were covering. But 3 of them, 3 specific events with specific timestamps and coordinates, corresponded to missing person cases in his geographic coverage area that shared the same profile as Brandon Swanson's. Sudden, inexplicable, no remains, no logical physical explanation, search operations that returned nothing. 3 cases he had never previously connected to one another. 3 cases that the public, the investigators and the families involved had no reason to connect to one another. 3 data points that, placed alongside the Swanson event, began to look less like coincidence and more like evidence of something systematic. Something random, something unpredictable, something that happened to the wrong people at the wrong moment and left the world unable to explain where they had gone. Because if a localized dimensional slip event was real, and if it could deposit a person somewhere outside the coordinate system we inhabit, then no amount of searching within our coordinate system would ever find them. They would not be in the ditch, they would not be in the river, they would not be in any field or culvert or tree line that search teams could access. They would be, in the most literal possible sense, elsewhere, not dead, not alive in any condition we could speak to, simply no longer here. In the final fragment of his journal that has been preserved, Verne wrote about what he called the tragedy of probability. He meant this in a specific way. If localized dimensional slip events occur randomly, unpredictably, in locations and at times that cannot be anticipated, then there is no way to avoid them. There is no warning system. There is no visible boundary. There is no sensation of approaching one. You would never know as you walked from your car toward the lights of a distant town on a quiet Minnesota night that the next step in front of you was not the same kind of step as the last 50,000 steps you had taken in your life. There is an implication to this that Werner, a scientist, stated plainly and without drama. If these events occur, then the world contains a category of disappearance that is not a crime, not an accident, not a medical event, not a choice. It is simply something that happens to the wrong person, in the wrong place at the wrong moment. A collision between an ordinary human trajectory and an extraordinary physical event, producing a consequence that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. A person walks, and then they do not walk. The phone call continues, and then it does not continue. The footprints go forward, and then they stop. And the people who love that person spend the rest of their lives searching in a coordinate system that no longer contains the person they are searching for. Brandon Swanson's family continued to advocate for him and for others in similar situations for years after his disappearance. His parents spoke publicly, worked with law enforcement, worked with legislators. The law that bears his name changed the way Minnesota handles missing adult cases. His story was covered in documentaries and podcasts and true crime investigations. He was not forgotten. His case was not closed in anyone's heart, but he was never found. No remains, no evidence, no body in a field or a ditch or a body of water. After more than 15 years, the landscape that swallowed him has not given anything back. Whatever happened in those last seconds of the phone call, whatever caused his voice to cut off, whatever made a 19-year-old walking home on a quiet spring night say those 2 words, has left no trace that conventional investigation has been able to interpret. Which is either the saddest version of a story that ends in tragedy we simply cannot document, or it is the evidence of something else entirely. Something Elias Verne spent years building a framework to understand before that framework was taken from him. Something that, if it exists, means Brandon Swanson did not die in Minnesota in May of 2008. He stepped, without knowing it, without choosing it, without any chance to prepare or resist or understand what was happening to him in the fraction of a second between recognition and whatever came next. He stepped into a fold in the fabric of the world, and the fold closed, and the coordinates where he had been standing reconnected to themselves, and the ground remembered the shape of his last footsteps. And then, nothing. The line went dead. The search found nothing. The years passed. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to families of the missing. It is different from the grief of loss, because loss implies finality, implies a world in which you know, even through the pain of knowing what happened. The grief of the missing is open-ended. It does not close. It does not settle into acceptance or into the slow, grinding work of learning to carry absence. It stays alive, because the person might be alive, and you do not know, and you will not know, and every day that passes without knowing is another day of the same unresolved ache. Annette and Brandon Swanson have carried that grief for over 15 years. They have carried it with grace and with purpose, channeling it into advocacy, into policy change, into the preservation of their son's memory. They have done everything that love can do in the face of a mystery it cannot solve. People often ask how families in this situation keep going. The answer, when you listen to parents of the missing speak about their lives, seems to involve a careful and deliberate division of the self. One part of you goes on, makes coffee, pays bills, answers emails, has conversations, shows up to things. That part learns to function around the hole. It does not fill the hole. It navigates around it with the practiced care of someone who has been living with the terrain long enough to know exactly where the edges are. The other part of you never stops looking. That part stays at the last place you heard from them, on the last night, in the last moment before the silence. That part of you is perpetually 47 minutes into a phone call that has not yet ended. There is something in Werner's work, in the fragments that survived, in the theory he constructed, that might, in a strange way, be a kind of answer. Not a comforting one. Not one that resolves the grief or fills the absence or brings anyone home, but a kind of answer nonetheless. If Werner was right, Brandon Swanson did not suffer. He did not fall into cold water and struggle and drown. He did not wander disoriented through cold fields and die alone of exposure. He did not experience the drawn-out terror of being lost and unable to find his way back. In the model Verne constructed, the event would have been instantaneous. The transition would have occurred so rapidly that subjective experience would not have had time to process it. One moment he was walking. The next moment, in the only sense that matters, there was no next moment. Not in this coordinate system, not in any space we can access or search or mourn over. He was simply elsewhere. Somewhere physics knows about, but we do not. Somewhere that exists in the mathematics, in the equations, in the careful theoretical models of researchers who study the behaviour of space at the edge of what we understand. Somewhere our grief cannot reach him, which is the loneliest thought of all. And somewhere, perhaps, he is still moving, still taking steps, still heading, in whatever direction that other coordinate system allows, toward whatever lights exist on its horizon. We do not know. We cannot know. We only know that a young man walked into the dark on a spring night in Minnesota, said 2 words, and stepped out of our ability to find him, and that the world has been searching ever since. What strikes me most when I sit with this case in the quiet is not the physics. It is not the sensor readings, or the gravitational models, or the academic papers that were removed from databases. It is the phone call, the 47 minutes, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the fact that 2 people who loved their son were present, genuinely, literally present, connected through a wire across the night, right up until the moment that they weren't. They heard everything. They heard every ordinary second of a walk that had no reason to be anything other than ordinary. And then in the same moment that they were still listening, he was already gone. That is the thing about the silence after, "Oh shit." It is not dramatic. It is not the sound of catastrophe. It is just the absence of a voice that was there a moment ago. Just the ambient hiss of an open line carrying nothing. Just the moment before you pull the phone from your ear and look at the screen and realise that the call has ended. And the call has ended, and you start dialing back, and nothing answers. Before we begin tonight, I want to take a moment to thank Jack's Jams, who left a comment suggesting this story. If you are listening on Spotify and you have not yet left a review, it truly helps the channel so much. Okay, let us get into it. There are cases that get solved. There are cases that get closed. And then there are cases that feel like something in between. Officially resolved, quietly filed away, but never quite finished in the minds of the people who looked too closely. The death of Elisa Lam in January of 2013 falls into that third category. A young woman from British Columbia, Canada, travelling alone along the California coast, checking into a downtown Los Angeles hotel that had seen more than its share of dark history. By the time her body was found, nearly 3 weeks after she vanished, the story had already taken on a life of its own. There was surveillance footage. There were questions, there were coincidences, or things that looked like coincidences, that refused to sit still no matter how many times the official record said they were nothing. This is not a story that tells you what happened to Elisa Lam. No one can do that with certainty. What this story does is follow the trail of a fictional investigative journalist named Marcus Vail, a composite figure built from the kinds of researchers, journalists, and obsessive internet detectives who spent years pulling at the threads of this case. Vail's theory is called the LAM protocol. It is not a proven fact. It is not a confirmed program. It is a hypothesis, constructed from documented history, declassified government files, and the particular architecture of a building that has stood in the middle of Los Angeles for nearly a century watching. And it begins, as so many things do, with a door that would not close. Act 1. The Disappearance. January 21st, 2013. Los Angeles is cold by Southern California standards. Not cold by any real measure, but cool and grey in the way the city sometimes gets in January, when the usual brightness feels muted and the streets around Skid Row carry that particular stillness that only comes in the early hours before the city wakes. The Cecil Hotel sits at 651 South Main Street, a 14-storey building that has occupied the same corner since 1924. It was built in an era of grand ambitions, when downtown Los Angeles was a genuine destination, and the hotel was intended to serve the travelling professional class. None of that ambition survived the decades that followed. By 2013, the Cecil was operating under a different name in part of its building, Stay on Main, a budget hostel on the upper floors catering to backpackers and budget travellers from around the world. The lower floors retained the Cecil name, a shadow of its original purpose. The neighbourhood around it had shifted dramatically across the decades. What had once been a hub of civic life had become something harder to classify. A dense, complicated urban zone where the architecture of old Los Angeles pressed up against the realities of a city that had moved on and left certain blocks behind. Elisa Lam was 21 years old. She was a student at the University of British Columbia, and she had come to California on what appeared to be a solo travel adventure. The kind of trip young people take when the world still feels like it is opening up rather than narrowing down. She had been documenting the journey on her Tumblr blog, writing with the kind of unguarded openness that social media in that era encouraged. She wrote about books and music and the particular feeling of being alone in a new place. Not lonely exactly, but solitary in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. She had visited San Diego and was making her way up the coast. Los Angeles was a stop along the way. She checked into the Cecil on January 26th. The days that followed, the hotel staff remembered her as polite and unremarkable. A young guest among many, carrying a backpack, keeping to herself in the way travellers do when they are moving through rather than staying. She had been in regular contact with her family in Vancouver. Then, around January 31st, the contact stopped. Her family waited. They tried calling. Nothing came back. By the first days of February, her parents had contacted the Los Angeles Police Department to report her missing. She had been travelling alone, active on social media, in regular contact with her family, and then, without warning, nothing. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. The LAPD opened a missing persons investigation. Officers canvassed the hotel, spoke with staff, reviewed what records they could. The case was difficult in the way that missing persons cases in large cities often are. The Cecil had hundreds of guests cycling through, and the surrounding neighbourhood was not one where disappearances went uncommon. But something about this case attracted attention, partly because of who Elisa was, a young, educated woman from a stable family with no obvious reason to vanish, and partly because of what the hotel's cameras had captured in the days before she disappeared. Act 1 continued the elevator footage. On February 14, 2013, the Los Angeles Police Department released surveillance footage from the Cecil Hotel's elevator system as part of their effort to generate leads. The footage spread across the internet with a speed that nothing in that era could quite predict. It was shared on Reddit, embedded in news articles, dissected on forums, and watched millions of times within days of its release. The reason was simple and immediate. Something about the footage felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely, and therefore impossible to dismiss. The clip shows a young woman, later confirmed to be Elisa Lam, entering an elevator on one of the hotel's floors. The footage has the quality of old analog surveillance video, slightly degraded, slightly too slow, the kind of visual texture that makes everything feel heavier than it is. Elisa enters the elevator and presses multiple buttons, more than she would need to press for any single destination. She leans out into the hallway and looks in both directions, as though checking whether someone is coming. She steps back inside. She steps back out. At one point she stands pressed against the interior wall of the elevator, as though trying to make herself invisible to whatever might be in the corridor outside. At another point she moves to the threshold of the elevator doors and extends both arms out into the hallway, moving them in slow, deliberate gestures, waving, almost, or reaching, the kind of movement that serves no obvious practical purpose. Her face, when the camera catches it directly, carries an expression that different viewers have described differently over the years. Fear, confusion, intoxication, dissociation. She appears to speak, though there is no audio to confirm what she says or whether she's speaking to anyone at all. The elevator doors never close. Throughout the entirety of the clip, which runs for several minutes, the doors remain open. They do not function the way elevator doors function. They do not respond to the button presses. They simply stay open, passively, as though the elevator itself has paused in some service state that has nothing to do with its occupant. What the footage showed was not conclusive. It was not proof of anything. But it was the kind of footage that occupies a specific space in the human mind, too strange to explain easily, too real to dismiss, too ambiguous to resolve. It stayed. Eventually Elisa walks out of the elevator and moves down the hallway, out of frame. The doors close, the elevator proceeds normally. Whatever had caused the disruption, the behaviour, the doors, the extended and inexplicable pause, passed without resolution. The footage ends, the investigation continued, and the questions it raised did not. Act 2, The Discovery, February 19th, 2013. A maintenance worker at the Cecil Hotel climbed to the roof to investigate a complaint that had been filtering up through the building staff for several days. Guests on the upper floors had reported that the water pressure was inconsistent, that the tap water had an unusual colour, that the taste was not right. These were the kinds of complaints that in a building like the Cecil could have any number of mundane explanations. The maintenance worker climbed to the roof, where the hotel's water supply tanks were located, and opened the first tank he checked. Elisa Lam was inside. She had been there for approximately 18 days. The tank was large enough to stand in, sealed with a heavy cover that required deliberate effort to open from the outside. She was found floating, unclothed, with her clothing found floating nearby in the same tank. There were no obvious external injuries. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no clear explanation at the point of discovery for how she'd gotten there, how she had accessed the roof, how she had opened the tank, how she had ended up inside it. The coroner's investigation that followed determined that her death was an accidental drowning. The toxicology reports found evidence of the medication she had been prescribed for her bipolar disorder, though at levels the coroner determined were not inconsistent with normal use. Bipolar disorder was listed as a significant contributing factor. The case was ruled accidental. The official record was closed. For most people, that was where the story ended. For Marcus Vale, it was where the story began. There were too many questions sitting quietly beneath the official conclusion. Not dramatic. Questions, not the kind that announce themselves with sirens and flashing lights, but the low, persistent kind that surface in the hours before sleep, the kind that do not go away. How had she accessed the roof? The roof was, by all accounts, kept locked, with access restricted to staff. How had she opened the water tank, which required significant physical effort and a particular knowledge of where to push, where to lift? How had she gotten inside and sealed it behind her? How had no one in the building, in the 18 days she lay in the tank that supplied the hotel's water, noticed anything definitive enough to act on sooner? The official answer to these questions was, essentially, that mental illness in acute crisis can produce behaviour that defies ordinary explanation. That a person experiencing a severe bipolar episode might do things that make no logical sense in retrospect. That the absence of a clear alternative explanation is not itself evidence of something sinister. These answers are not wrong. They are not lies. But they are the kind of answers that, if you have spent any time studying the documented history of what certain agencies of the United States government were capable of doing to ordinary people in the name of research, do not quite sit flat. They leave a slight ridge, and Marcus Vale was the kind of person who noticed ridges. Act 3. The pattern. Vale had been a researcher and journalist for nearly 15 years by the time the Elisa Lam case captured his attention. He had spent much of his career in the space that occupies the uncomfortable middle ground between conspiracy theory and documented history, the territory where things that seem improbable turn out to be real, where things that sound paranoid turn out to have paper trails. He had written about COINTELPRO, the FBI program that ran from 1956 to 1971, and surveilled, infiltrated, and actively disrupted civil rights organisations, anti-war groups, and political movements. He had written about Operation Paperclip, the program through which the United States government brought former Nazi scientists into American research institutions after World War II. He was not a man who dismissed things easily. He was also not a man who invented connections out of thin air. What caught his attention first was not the elevator footage. It was a name. In the weeks following the discovery of Elisa Lam's body, an outbreak of tuberculosis was confirmed in the neighbourhood surrounding the Cecil Hotel. The outbreak was significant enough to prompt public health officials to use a particular diagnostic test widely and urgently in the area. The test was called the LAM ELISA test, a real documented medical screening tool used specifically for tuberculosis detection. Its name is a technical acronym, Lipoarabenomannan Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent Assay. The name of the deceased, Lam. Her first name, Elisa. Officially it was a coincidence. Medically, the name of the test had nothing to do with the name of the woman. The acronym predated her birth by decades. The overlap was the kind of thing the universe produces regularly, the collision of unrelated syllables that the pattern-seeking human mind cannot help but notice and assign meaning to. Vale was clear-eyed about this. He had been around long enough to know that coincidences are real, that the mind is wired to find patterns even where none exist, and that the history of conspiracy thinking is littered with connections that turned out to be nothing more than the chaos of ordinary life arranging itself into shapes that look like meaning. He knew all of this, and he still could not stop thinking about the name. Not because he believed the name was a code, not because he believed someone had arranged events to produce that coincidence, but because the name was the thing that made him look more carefully at the broader context, at the hotel, at the neighbourhood, at the history of the city itself. And when he looked, he found something that was considerably less coincidental than a shared syllable. Act 3 continued the hotel and its history. The Cecil Hotel has a history that would be difficult to invent. Since its opening in 1924, the building has been the site of more than a dozen confirmed deaths, suicides, murders, accidents, and cases that have never been fully classified. In the 1940s, a woman named Pauline Otten fell from a 9th floor window and landed on a pedestrian passing below on the sidewalk, killing them both. In 1984, a man named Jack Unterweger, later confirmed as a serial killer who had murdered women in multiple countries, stayed at the Cecil while committing murders in the Los Angeles area. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was a long-term resident during his killing spree in 1985. These facts are documented. They are not disputed. They have made the Cecil a landmark of a particular and grim variety, the kind of place that true crime documentaries and horror novelists return to, because the building itself seems to function as a gravitational centre for human darkness. There is a version of the Cecil story that attributes this purely to geography and economics. The hotel is in a neighbourhood that has struggled for decades. It has historically priced itself at the bottom of the market, and the kinds of people who ended up there were often the kinds of people who were already in crisis when they arrived. That explanation is reasonable. It is the one most historians and journalists who have written about the Cecil settle on, and Vale accepted it as far as it went. But Vale had been researching something specific in the months before the Lamb case drew his attention. He had been following a thread in declassified documents related to the domestic surveillance and behavioural research programs of the Cold War era, programs that operated in American cities, often without the knowledge or consent of the cities themselves, and that had used ordinary public and semi-public spaces as observation environments. And what he found when he pulled that thread in the direction of Los Angeles was that downtown Los Angeles had been a particularly active zone for certain kinds of federally connected observation work in the mid-20th century. No document he found linked the Cecil Hotel directly to any federal program. That gap is important, and Vale acknowledged it. But the building's location, its transient population, its historical function as a place where people arrived without roots and stayed without being closely tracked, all of these qualities made it, on paper, precisely the kind of environment that behavioural researchers of the Cold War era had identified as ideal for human observation work. Not because anything in the building was necessarily installed or arranged, but because the building itself, by its nature, created conditions that researchers in that era had explicitly described as optimal: high anonymity, high stress, low social accountability, and a population unlikely to report unusual experiences to authorities. 4. The hidden program. To understand the hypothesis Vale was developing, it is necessary to understand something about MKUltra. Not the sensationalized version, not the Hollywood shorthand in which MKUltra is simply a catch-all explanation for mind control and government evil, but the documented, declassified, congressionally investigated reality of what the program actually was. MKUltra was a project of the Central Intelligence Agency that ran from 1953 to at least 1973. It was a successor to earlier programs with names like Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird, all of which were aimed at the same fundamental question: could the human mind be controlled, manipulated, or broken down through chemical, psychological, or physical means, and could that process be weaponized? The Cold War context mattered enormously. American intelligence officials were convinced that the Soviet Union and China were developing psychological techniques for use against American prisoners and agents. The response was to develop equivalent, or superior, capabilities. What MKUltra actually involved, as documented in the files that survived the 1973 order to destroy the program's records, an order that was only partially carried out, was extraordinary in scope. The program funded research at universities, hospitals and private institutions across the United States and Canada. It conducted experiments using LSD, mescaline, barbiturates and other drugs on subjects who frequently did not know they were receiving experimental compounds. It explored sensory deprivation, hypnosis, psychological manipulation and the systematic dismantling of individual identity. Some subjects were volunteers, many were not. Some were prisoners, some were mental patients, some were ordinary people who had no idea what was being done to them. The program became publicly known in 1975 through a combination of congressional investigations, including the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission, and a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist John Marks that surfaced approximately 16,000 documents that had escaped the destruction order. What those documents revealed was disturbing enough that it prompted Senate hearings and public apologies from the CIA director of the time. And then, officially, MK-Ultra ended. The program was terminated. The CIA disavowed the methods. The research was concluded. That was the official version. For researchers like Vail, the official version raised a specific and uncomfortable question. What happened to the researchers, the scientists and psychologists, and behavioural specialists who had spent decades developing techniques for psychological manipulation did not simply retire. They did not stop being scientists. They did not unlearn what they had learned. Some went into private practice, some returned to universities, some entered other government programs under different names and different funding structures. The infrastructure of knowledge that had been built across 20 years of federally funded behavioural research did not disappear because the CIA said it did. It diffused. It changed shape. It continued in ways that declassified records, by their nature, are precisely designed not to reveal. Vail was not the first person to suggest this. The literature on post-MK-Ultra behavioural research programs is small but not empty. Researchers and journalists had identified what appeared to be successor programs operating under different names. Programs that replaced overt chemical experimentation with subtler methodologies that moved the locus of research from laboratory settings to the real world, and that replaced unwilling subjects in controlled environments with something considerably more sophisticated and considerably harder to prove: the observation and subtle manipulation of ordinary people in ordinary spaces who had no idea they were being watched. Act 4 continued. The behavioural testing theory. The specific methodology Vail became interested in had a name in the academic literature, though it was described in dry technical language that obscured how radical the underlying idea was. The concept was environmental behavioural modification, the use of physical spaces, sensory inputs, and controlled stimuli to produce measurable psychological effects in subjects who were not aware of being studied. The research history here is real. It predates MK-Ultra and extends well beyond it. Psychologists and architects have known for decades that the design of physical spaces has measurable effects on human behaviour and cognition. Light levels, sound frequencies, spatial proportions, the visibility or invisibility of exits, the texture of floors and walls, all of these can be adjusted to produce predictable shifts in how people feel and behave. This knowledge has been applied openly and legitimately in the design of hospitals, schools, retail environments and public spaces around the world. What made Vail's research disturbing was not the existence of this knowledge. It was the question of what certain agencies might have done with it in the years after MK-Ultra, specifically whether the shift from chemical to environmental manipulation represented not the end of behavioural research programs, but their evolution into something subtler, harder to detect, and potentially still active. The theoretical framework Vail developed worked as follows. A building like the Cecil, in a neighbourhood like the one surrounding it, presented a naturally occurring research environment with several properties that would be valuable to behavioural researchers operating under constraints. The population was highly transient. The residents were already under elevated stress. The building's physical infrastructure, its corridors, its elevator systems, its lighting, its acoustic properties, could be adjusted in ways that fell well within ordinary maintenance activities and would not attract attention. and the surrounding neighbourhood's history with public health crises, law enforcement activity and social services meant that unusual behaviour by residents was unlikely to receive serious investigative scrutiny. The theory did not require any single dramatic intervention. It required only the sustained, subtle adjustment of an existing environment, the kind of adjustment that could be maintained over years or decades by a small number of people with access to the building's infrastructure, operating well below the threshold of anything that would register as unusual. Vail called the hypothetical program the LAM protocol, borrowing the initials for a name that was, he was careful to say, his own construction, rather than any documented title. He was not claiming that a program by that name existed in any government file. He was constructing a theoretical framework that could explain the pattern of events he had observed, and giving it a name because unnamed things are harder to think about clearly. Act 5. The elevator Vail returned to the elevator footage with the LAM protocol framework in mind, and he consulted an elevator systems technician, a retired specialist who had spent 30 years maintaining elevator systems in Los Angeles commercial buildings. Vail described what the footage showed, without identifying the building or the subject, and asked a technical question. Was there any legitimate mechanical explanation for an elevator that remained open for an extended period with unresponsive controls in the middle of the night, with no documented maintenance activity? The technician's answer was specific. Elevator systems of the type installed in older Los Angeles commercial buildings constructed or extensively renovated in the mid-20th century, which described a significant portion of the city's hotel stock, included a service mode that was designed for maintenance access. In service mode, the elevator's doors could be held open indefinitely, the floor buttons would behave differently than in normal operation, and the system would remain in a suspended state until manually returned to standard operation. The mode was accessible via a physical key on the elevator panel, a key that was typically held by maintenance staff and building engineers. There was no record of maintenance activity on that elevator on the night of the footage. No work order, no maintenance log, no staff report. If the elevator had been placed in service mode, someone had done so off the books, or someone had left it in that state from a previous activity and failed to return it to normal operation. Or, and this is the part of the technician's answer that stayed with Vail, certain older elevator systems had been documented to enter service mode spontaneously under specific electrical conditions, particularly in buildings with aging infrastructure where the power supply was inconsistent. The behaviour of the elevator in the footage was technically explicable without invoking human intent. It just required conditions that neither the hotel management nor the investigating authorities appeared to have formally assessed. Vail sat with this information for several days. He was not a man who needed things to be sinister. He had spent too long in the space between documented fact and documented speculation to romanticize conspiracy. But the elevator represented something that bothered him on a practical level, a gap in the record, not a proof of malice, not a confirmation of his theory, simply a gap, an unexplained event in an already unexplained case, a variable that had not been formally accounted for in the official record of a case that the official record had closed. In any investigation worth its name, unexplained variables are not dismissed. They are documented, examined, and either resolved or acknowledged as unresolved. The elevator had been neither. It appeared in the surveillance footage that became globally famous. It was never formally explained, and its behaviour, doors that would not close, controls that would not respond, a system that remained in a state no ordinary user would have chosen or understood, had coloured the entire public perception of Elisa Lam's final night in ways that the official record had never adequately addressed. Act 5 continued. The final hours. Vail spent weeks reconstructing what could be known about Elisa Lam's movements in the hours before her death. The official investigation had done this as well, but from a different perspective, looking for a cause of death, looking for signs of foul play or the absence thereof, looking for the simplest explanation that fit the available evidence. Vail was looking for something different. He was looking for the shape of the experience itself. What had she seen? What had she felt? What was the sequence of perceptions and reactions that had led a 21-year-old student from British Columbia to a sealed water tank on the roof of a hotel she had checked into 5 days earlier? What Vale was able to reconstruct was, in some ways, as disturbing as what had been officially documented. The surveillance footage showed behaviour that was qualitatively different from a person who was simply disoriented or confused. It showed behaviour that resembled something more specific, the kind of hypervigilance, the searching of empty corridors, the pressing of multiple buttons as though trying to generate options in a narrowing situation that researchers in psychological trauma describe as a particular response to perceived threat. Not necessarily a real threat, not necessarily a hallucinated one. The response to perceived threat, the neurological pattern, can be triggered by conditions that are not objectively dangerous, but that the brain, for whatever reason, is interpreting as such. Environmental manipulation, if Vale's theoretical framework was correct, would produce exactly this pattern. A person exposed to sustained sensory disruption, to subtle alterations in light or sound or spatial perception that the conscious mind could not fully identify or explain, would experience a rising sense of unease that they could not locate in any specific source. They would search, they would look for exits, they would become hyper-vigilant in corridors where nothing visible was wrong. They would behave to any observer as though responding to a threat that was not there. And if they had a pre-existing neurological vulnerability, if they were, for instance, a young woman with a documented history of mood disorders, travelling alone in an unfamiliar city, already somewhat isolated from her support networks, the threshold for that response would be lower. The conditions required to tip the brain into a crisis state would be less extreme. The observable outcome would arrive faster and be more severe. Vale was not claiming this was what had happened. He could not claim it. There was no evidence that any environmental manipulation had taken place. There was no evidence of any active program targeting Elisa Lam or anyone else at the Cecil Hotel in 2013. What Vale had was a hypothesis, a theoretical framework that fit the pattern of events with uncomfortable precision, and a documented history of government programs that had done things precisely this extreme to ordinary people in the not-so-distant past. Act 6. The conspiracy theory of why Lam Protocol, as Vale framed it, was not a targeted program. This was the part of his hypothesis that departed most significantly from conventional conspiracy thinking, which tends to imagine victims as targets, people who were selected because they knew something, or had something, or were threatening to someone. Elisa Lam, in Vale's framework, was not a target. She was a subject of opportunity. The distinction mattered enormously to him, both theoretically and ethically. He was not suggesting that someone had identified Elisa Lam and decided to harm her. He was suggesting something considerably colder, that if a behavioural observation environment had existed at the Cecil Hotel, a space subtly designed or maintained to observe how human beings responded to stress, isolation, and environmental manipulation, then anyone who entered that space was a potential data point. The program, if it existed, would not have needed to select subjects. It would simply have observed whoever was present. The hotel's transient population provided a continuous self-renewing pool of research subjects, each arriving with their own history and vulnerabilities, each passing through an environment that was not what it appeared to be. The purpose, in Vale's framework, would have been the same as the purpose that motivated MKUltra and its documented predecessors, understanding how human perception and cognition break down under controlled conditions, with an eye toward both offensive application, producing similar breakdowns intentionally in target individuals, and defensive application, understanding and hardening against the same techniques when used by adversaries. The Cold War had ended. But the research apparatus it had created did not end with it. The questions it had been designed to answer had not become less interesting to the agencies that had funded them. The methodology had simply become more sophisticated, more dispersed, and considerably harder to find. What Vale was proposing in its most stripped-down form was this: that certain buildings in certain American cities had been, at some point in the 20th century, modified to function as passive behavioural observation environments in which the ordinary events of ordinary life, the comings and goings of transient residents, the small crises and larger ones, produced data that was collected and analysed by people who were never present in the building, never identifiable, and never required to do anything that looked like research from the outside. No experiment to run, no researchers to embed, no injections to administer. Simply an environment, carefully constructed, carefully maintained, and invisible to everyone inside it, that produced over decades a continuous stream of data about how human beings behave when they are under stress and do not know they are being watched. Act 7, the cover. One of the elements of the Lamb protocol theory that Vale found most persuasive and most disturbing was not what it required to be true, but what it required to remain invisible. The answer was almost nothing. The official ruling of accidental drowning in the context of a young woman with a documented history of bipolar disorder was not suspicious. It was, from the perspective of anyone who needed the case to close quickly and cleanly, the ideal outcome. Mental illness as a contributing factor in an accidental death does not require investigation. It does not suggest external causation. It does not point toward anyone or anything. It is a self-contained explanation that carries within it its own closure. A tragic accident involving a vulnerable young woman. The case was closed. The building was still operating. Life continued. Vale spent months attempting to obtain records from the Cecil Hotel, building access logs from the relevant period, maintenance records for the elevator systems, the complete surveillance footage from the night depicted in the released clip. The released clip was, by multiple accounts, edited from a longer original, and the full footage was never made publicly available. His requests were met with responses that range from partial compliance to outright denial. The hotel management, later its new owners under a renovation project, cited privacy concerns, incomplete record keeping, and the ordinary limitations of a business that had changed hands multiple times in the intervening years. None of these denials were inherently suspicious. Hotels do not keep comprehensive records indefinitely. Surveillance footage is routinely overwritten. Maintenance logs are maintained for practical rather than historical purposes and are often incomplete. The absence of records proved nothing. But the absence of records, Vale noted, was also precisely what a genuine behavioural observation programme would have been designed to produce. Not false records, not forged records, simply no records. The ordinary unremarkable absence of documentation that attends the ordinary unremarkable operations of a building that is simply going about its business day after day, year after year, in a neighbourhood where no one is paying particularly close attention. The efficiency of the invisible was the thing that haunted Vale most. Not the dramatic conspiracy, not the men in black suits and the shadowy meetings and the classified briefings, but the bureaucratic banality of a programme that operated by doing almost nothing detectable, in a place where almost nothing was noticed, affecting people who had almost no power to be believed if they said something was wrong. The architecture of invisibility was not a wall or a lock. It was simply the aggregate of ordinary things, ordinary neglect, ordinary indifference, ordinary gaps in record keeping, arranged in a way that left no seams to pull at. Act 7 continued. The missing data. There is a specific category of archival problem that historians and investigative journalists encounter when researching Cold War-era programs, and Vale had become intimately familiar with it over the course of his career. It is not the problem of finding records that say something damning. It is the problem of finding the shape of the space where records should be. When the CIA destroyed the majority of MKUltra's files in 1973, they did not destroy them completely. The remaining 16,000 documents that John Marks recovered through the Freedom of Information Act existed precisely because they had been misfiled, routed to a financial records office rather than the main program archive, and therefore missed when the destruction order was carried out. The shape of the missing documents, the gaps between what survived and what clearly should have been there, told its own story. Researchers who studied the surviving files could see the outlines of programs that had no corresponding documentation, the ghosts of experiments that had been deliberately removed from the record. Vale applied the same methodology to the Cecil Hotel and came away with something he found genuinely unsettling. Not a smoking gun, Not a document that said what he suspected it might say, but a pattern of absence that was itself a kind of presence. Records that should have existed, that any functioning business generates as a matter of ordinary operation, and that were either unavailable or incomplete in ways that did not match the hotel's operational history in other periods. Gaps that were too consistent to be entirely explained by ordinary record-keeping failures. He could not prove this meant anything. He was the first to say so. But in his experience, the shape of a deliberate absence and the shape of an accidental one were different in ways that became recognisable with practice, and what he was looking at had the shape of the former, not proof, not evidence in any legal sense, but the particular texture of a record that has been managed, carefully, quietly, with the kind of long-term institutional patience that only certain kinds of organisations sustain across decades. Epilogue: What Remains. Elisa Lam was buried in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was 21 years old. Her family has described her as a bright, curious young woman who loved literature, who documented her inner life with honesty and care, who was travelling, as many young people travel, with the mixture of independence and vulnerability that defines that particular season of life. She did not deserve what happened to her, whatever happened to her. The Cecil Hotel was renamed the Hotel Cecil, and later underwent a significant renovation and conversion project. The building still stands at 651 South Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. The water tanks are still on the roof. The elevator system has been updated. The neighbourhood around it continues to change in the way Los Angeles neighbourhoods change, slowly, unevenly, with the pressure of money and the weight of history pressing in from different directions at once. The official explanation for Elisa Lam's death remains what it was in 2013. Accidental drowning, with bipolar disorder as a contributing factor. The coroner's ruling stands. The case is closed. There is no ongoing investigation. There is no open inquiry. There is no government body presently examining the circumstances of her death. The elevator footage is still on YouTube. You can watch it right now. People still do, in enormous numbers, years after it was first released. Something about it resists resolution. Something about it, the unresponsive doors, the slow, deliberate gestures, the quality of attention she seems to be paying to something that is not visible on camera, continues to produce, in the people who watch it, the feeling that they are not seeing everything, that the frame of the camera, by definition, excludes something, that what is absent from the footage may be as significant as what is present. That feeling, the sense that the frame excludes something significant, is not evidence of anything, but it is also not nothing. It is the reason the footage has been watched tens of millions of times. It is the reason Marcus Vail spent years on a theory he could not prove. It is the reason you are listening to this right now. The Lam Protocol is a theory. It is not a fact. The connection between Elisa Lam and any government program is not documented, not proven, and not confirmable with the records that are currently publicly available. Marcus Vail is a composite figure, a name for the kind of inquiry that the Elisa Lam case has generated in thousands of people who were not professional researchers, who had no particular stake in the outcome, who simply watched the elevator footage and could not stop asking questions. MKUltra is real. Its successor programs, some documented, some strongly implied by the surviving record, some entirely unconfirmed, are real in the sense that the conditions that produced them are real, that the institutional knowledge they generated is real, that the people who developed their methods did not simply stop when the programs were officially ended. The history of what the United States government was willing to do to ordinary people in the name of research in the 20th century is documented, publicly available, and considerably darker than most people who have not specifically gone looking for it tend to realise. None of that makes the Lam Protocol true, but it does make it harder to dismiss. In the hours before dawn, on January 31st, 2013, a young woman who was someone's daughter and someone's friend walked into an elevator in downtown Los Angeles and pressed buttons that did not work. She looked for something she could not name in corridors that, by all official accounts, held nothing to be afraid of. She ended up somewhere she should not have been able to reach, in a space that should not have been possible to access, in circumstances that the official record describes as tragic and accidental and closed. The elevator doors have long since been repaired. The water tanks have been drained and cleaned and returned to their ordinary function. The footage is still playing, somewhere, right now, on a screen somewhere in the world, watched by someone who is noticing, for the first time, or for the 100th time, the way the doors refuse to close, the way she looks, not at the camera, but at something just beyond the frame, the way the elevator waits and waits and waits, as though it is holding something in suspension that it is not yet ready to release. Some explanations are convenient, some coincidences are only coincidences, some cases are exactly what they appear to be. A tragedy, a loss, a gap in the world where a young woman used to be. Most of the time, the simplest explanation is also the correct one. The official record is usually right, but in a city full of cameras, in a building with 100 years of history, in a case where the records are incomplete and the footage is cut and the doors would not close, it is worth asking at least once what the frame is not showing you, what the official record was designed to exclude, and whether the most convincing explanation is so convincing precisely because someone needed it to be. Sleep well tonight, sleepy koala army. And remember, if you are somewhere out there watching this before bed, or listening in the dark, or thinking about the next time you step into an elevator in a building that has been standing longer than you have been alive, sometimes the most unsettling thing is not what you can see. It is what the camera cannot show you, what the record does not contain, what the frame was built to leave out. Elisa Lam deserved answers. She deserved a world in which questions like these were unnecessary. Whatever the truth of her final hours turns out to be, if it ever turns out to be anything at all, she deserved better than an empty corridor and a door that would not close. And before the night takes us under, if you're listening on Spotify, please take 10 seconds and leave a review. It helps this channel more than you could possibly know, and it means the world to every single member of this community. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are going underground. November 1992. It begins not with a discovery. It begins with interference. Somewhere in the vast and frozen interior of Alaska, at a remote seismic monitoring station surrounded by nothing but pine, permafrost and silence, a technician sits alone at a bank of instruments. The equipment around her is designed for one purpose only: to listen, to wait, to detect the deep geological exhale of the Earth itself, the trembling of tectonic plates, the low groan of shifting crust, the fingerprint of a distant earthquake rolling across thousands of miles of bedrock before arriving here, in this cold room, on these humming screens. She has done this job for 3 years. She knows what the instruments are supposed to say. She knows the rhythms and the noise and the silence between them. And so when the readout changes, when a signal begins to emerge from the baseline that does not belong, she notices immediately. It is not seismic. Not exactly. The frequency is wrong. The interval is wrong. Earthquakes are chaotic, jagged, unpredictable. They spike and fade. They scatter. This signal does none of those things. This signal pulses, low, steady, at intervals so precise they would later be measured to fractions of a millisecond. Not a tremor, not noise, not instrument error. A rhythm, repeating, patient. As though something deep beneath the ground had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. She reports it up the chain. The response is quick and routine, equipment calibration issue, likely interference from a nearby installation, nothing to investigate. Log it and move on. She logs it, but the signal does not move on. 3 days later, a station 200 miles to the southeast picks up the same frequency. Then a third station, then a fourth. Each reading consistent, each pulsing in perfect synchronization. The signal is not coming from the equipment, the signal is coming from the ground. And when triangulation software maps the origin point, the coordinates land somewhere in the Alaskan interior, deep in the wilderness, far from any city, far from any known installation, not far from Denali, the highest peak in North America, a mountain so vast, so ancient, so utterly indifferent to human presence that it generates its own weather systems and its own mythology. A place the Athabascan people called Denali, long before European cartographers arrived to rename it, to measure it, to claim it. The mountain has always kept its secrets, but now something beneath it is trying to speak. Act 1. The survey. The geological survey team that was assembled in the weeks following the initial anomaly reports was small, deliberately so. 4 members, a geophysicist, 2 technicians, a logistics coordinator. Their brief was minimal: travel to the approximate source coordinates, deploy ground-penetrating radar equipment, rule out any natural explanations for the signal readings, and return. Standard protocol. A routine sweep of a remote area. Nothing remarkable was expected. The journey alone took the better part of a week. There are no roads where the coordinates pointed. There is no infrastructure. There is wilderness in the truest sense of that word. Terrain that has not meaningfully changed since the last ice age, forests dense enough to swallow sound whole, rivers that shift their banks seasonally, and a cold so absolute in November that the air itself seems to resist your presence. The team travelled by bush plane, then by snowcat, then on foot. They brought with them the kind of equipment that sees through solid rock. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, works by transmitting radio wave pulses into the earth and measuring how they bounce back. Different materials reflect differently. Soil and bedrock produce one kind of return. Voids produce another. Structures, hollow spaces, chambers, organised forms, produce something else entirely. A trained eye can read those returns the way a doctor reads a scan. You learn to see what the surface refuses to show you. The first day of scanning produced nothing unusual. The second day, the readings began to shift. The returns from the deepest pulses, those reaching several hundred feet below the surface, were coming back wrong. Not malformed, not corrupt. Wrong in a specific, structured, impossible-to-ignore way. The team recalibrated. They checked the equipment from multiple angles. They ran comparison baselines. Every check confirmed what the initial readings had shown. Beneath the permafrost, beneath several hundred feet of ancient, undisturbed rock, there was a shape that had no business being there. The geophysicist on the team, a man named Roland Marsh, according to documents that would surface years later, reportedly sat in silence for a very long time after reviewing the composite scan. He had spent 20 years reading geological data. He had surveyed mountain ranges and ocean floors. He had studied formations that challenged every assumption about natural geology. He had never seen anything like this. The shape was symmetrical, four-sided, each face inclined at a consistent angle toward a single, converging point at the top. The geometry was not approximate, it was not close, it was exact in a way that natural stone formations simply are not. Nature produces beauty, yes. Nature produces breathtaking complexity. But nature does not produce perfect angles, at perfect ratios, at perfect scale, buried perfectly beneath hundreds of feet of undisturbed earth. The shape was a pyramid, and according to the initial field measurements, it was significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. AC2, the shape, beneath the world. Let's be very precise about what the measurements suggested, because precision matters here. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands approximately 480 feet tall at its original height. Its base spans approximately 756 feet on each side. It is, by every reasonable measure, one of the largest structures ever constructed by human hands. A monument so vast it generates its own atmospheric microclimate. A structure so precisely aligned that its corners point within a fraction of a degree to true north. The formation detected beneath the Alaskan interior, according to the field readings compiled by Roland Marsh's team, exceeded those dimensions considerably. The base measurements were difficult to determine precisely given the depth and the equipment available, but conservative estimates placed the span at well over 1,000 feet. The apex, the highest point of the structure as detected by the radar returns, sat hundreds of feet below the surface, meaning the structure itself extended even deeper. Its full vertical dimension could not be measured with the equipment on hand. To put that in terms that make it easier to feel rather than just understand. Imagine burying the Empire State Building entirely underground, then building something significantly larger directly beside it, and then burying that too. That is the approximate scale of what the radar suggested was sitting beneath the Alaskan wilderness, completely hidden, completely silent except for that low, rhythmic pulse that had started all of this. The team spent 3 additional days scanning. Every pass confirmed the same readings. Every angle reinforced the same geometry. The signal, the original signal that had triggered the entire investigation, appeared to emanate from within the structure itself, from somewhere near its centre, from somewhere deep inside whatever this thing was. On the 4th day, Marsh filed his preliminary report via encrypted satellite communication. Within 48 hours, the team was contacted and told to stand down. They were instructed to secure all data, all equipment, all physical notes, and prepare for extraction. A second team would take over the site. No further information was provided, no explanation was given. The team was airlifted out. Their equipment was confiscated at the staging point. Their personal notes were collected. They were separately debriefed, signed non-disclosure documentation, and dispersed. Roland Marsh would not speak publicly about what he saw for more than a decade. When he eventually did speak, in fragments, to a single researcher who spent years earning his trust, he said only this: "The geometry was real. I have never been able to explain it, and I have spent a very long time trying." Act 3. Classification. The apparatus of government secrecy is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive, with black helicopters and men in dark suits delivering ultimatums, though that image has become so embedded in the popular imagination that we sometimes forget how bureaucratic and mundane the real machinery of classification actually is. Most secrets are kept not through intimidation but through paperwork, through the quiet reassignment of jurisdiction, through the reclassification of file categories, through the slow, methodical layering of one administrative wall upon another until the original thing, the original event, the original finding, becomes inaccessible, not because it was destroyed, but because it was buried beneath 1,000 layers of bureaucratic fog. Control of the Denali site was reassigned within days of the original team's extraction. The jurisdiction passed through at least 3 separate governmental entities before landing with a joint operational body that had connections to both defence research and what was officially described as geological hazard assessment. The site itself was designated a restricted geological anomaly zone, a classification that exists in Federal Land Management Code and that is, in practice, almost never invoked. It is a designation with no fixed duration. It requires no public notice. It can be maintained indefinitely without congressional review. The area around the coordinates was quietly added to restricted airspace maps. Ground access was designated off-limits under environmental protection statutes that, while technically accurate, were not the real reason for the restriction. Scientists and researchers who subsequently tried to obtain permits to conduct independent surveys of the region found their applications delayed, then denied, then rerouted through bureaucratic channels that led nowhere. One internal document, a single page, partially redacted, that would surface decades later through a Freedom of Information filing that itself took 9 years to process, described the formation in terms that have never been officially acknowledged or retracted. The document referred to the structure as non-natural, non-random, non-replicable. 3 words, that is all. But those 3 words, in the cold language of government scientific assessment, carry an extraordinary weight. Non-natural means it did not form through geological processes. Non-random means its geometry is deliberate. Non-replicable means that no known human construction methodology, not ancient, not modern, not theoretical, could account for what the scans showed. The document was stamped, filed, and buried, and the mountain kept its silence. For a while. Acid 4, Dr. Aaron Vance. There is a particular kind of scientist who is drawn not to the questions that have answers, but to the questions that have been abandoned. The ones that sit in archive folders and filing cabinets and digitized database records, untouched not because they were resolved, but because the people who might have resolved them were told in one way or another to look somewhere else. These scientists are not conspiracy theorists. They are in many respects the opposite. Meticulous, sceptical, methodologically conservative people who have simply noticed that certain data sets do not add up, and who find that fact more interesting than the approved explanation. Dr. Aaron Vance was one of these people. He had spent the majority of his career in geophysics, specifically in the study of low-frequency seismic signals and their relationship to geological stress patterns. His work was unglamorous and largely invisible to the public. He published in specialist journals. He presented at conferences attended by other specialists. He was, by all professional accounts, good at what he did and entirely uninterested in anything beyond the data. The data, however, eventually led him somewhere unexpected. It began during an archival project in the mid-2000s, when Vance was reviewing seismic records from the early 1990s as part of a broader study into baseline signal drift across North American monitoring stations. He was looking for a completely different thing, a specific pattern related to glacial isostatic adjustment, the slow geological rebound of land masses as ancient ice sheets continue to retreat thousands of years after the last ice age. What he found instead, buried in the archived data from multiple Alaskan stations, was a set of readings he could not explain. A low-frequency signal, rhythmic, originating from a fixed geographic point, present across multiple independent stations simultaneously. The signal had been logged, briefly noted as anomalous, and then apparently dismissed without further investigation. Vance ran the coordinates. They pointed to the Alaskan interior, not far from Denali. He cross-referenced with every known catalogue of seismic events from that period. Nothing matched. He checked for industrial activity, military testing, known underground infrastructure. Nothing in the area. He reviewed the signal characteristics against his own extensive experience with naturally occurring geological phenomena. Nothing in the natural world produced signals with that frequency profile and that degree of rhythmic precision. And then he ran the archived data against the current monitoring feeds. The signal was still there, not continuous, not always detectable at the same intensity, but present, recurring, originating from the same fixed coordinates it had occupied in 1992. 12 years later, the ground beneath the Alaskan interior was still pulsing. Whatever was down there had not stopped. Act 5, the mathematical pattern. The thing that distinguishes a scientist from a speculator is what they do when they encounter something they cannot explain. A speculator reaches for the most dramatic interpretation. A scientist reaches for more data. Vance spent the better part of 2 years doing nothing but gathering more data. He built a comprehensive time series record of every detectable instance of the signal, across every accessible monitoring station in the region, going back to the earliest available records. He normalized for equipment variation, seasonal temperature effects, atmospheric interference, and baseline drift. He applied every standard correction factor. And when the corrected data was laid out, what he found beneath all the noise was something that made him sit very still for a very long time. The signal followed a mathematical sequence, not approximately, not loosely, precisely. The intervals between pulse clusters corresponded to a recursive numerical pattern, a sequence in which each value is a function of the preceding values in a fixed and repeating relationship. The kind of pattern that, in nature, appears in the branching of plants and the spiral geometry of shells and the proportional relationships of living structures. The kind of pattern that mathematicians have studied for centuries because it appears again and again at the intersections of natural growth and fundamental physics. It was not random noise that happened to look like a pattern. It was a pattern, one that would require either an extraordinary coincidence of natural forces or something far more unsettling: design. Vance wrote up his findings internally. He shared them with 2 colleagues whose judgment he trusted completely. Scientists with no prior knowledge of or interest in the Denali region. People who had no reason to confirm what he was seeing if it wasn't genuinely there. Both confirmed it. The pattern was real, the sequence was mathematically coherent, and the signal producing it was coming from somewhere beneath the Alaskan wilderness, from a fixed point in the Earth, and it had been doing so for at least as long as the monitoring record existed. Vance began, cautiously, to develop a hypothesis. What if the signal was not a byproduct? What if it was not geological noise or residual vibration from some ancient inert structure? What if the signal was the point? What if whatever was buried beneath Denali was not simply sitting there, but operating? A key to 6. The energy anomaly. A structure can be inert. The pyramids of Giza are inert. They sit. They endure. They do nothing except exist. And that existence is remarkable enough that millions of people travel thousands of miles every year simply to stand near them. But they are passive, stone arranged by human hands, massive and magnificent, but ultimately just matter in a particular configuration. What Vance was looking at was not inert. His analysis of the signal's characteristics, its frequency profile, its interaction with the surrounding geological matrix, the way it propagated through different rock types at different depths, led him to a conclusion that he described in his private notes as the most uncomfortable finding of my professional life. The signal was not merely passing through the rock. It was interacting with it in ways that suggested an active electromagnetic relationship between the source and the surrounding material. In the immediate vicinity of the source coordinates, the zone directly above and around whatever was generating the pulse, the geological data showed something extraordinary. Seismic noise was lower than it should be, significantly lower. The background vibration that exists everywhere on Earth, the constant low-level trembling produced by ocean waves and atmospheric pressure and distant human activity and 1,000 other sources, was measurably suppressed in that region, as though something was absorbing it, or cancelling it. The electromagnetic readings from the area were also anomalous. Instruments designed to measure the Earth's natural magnetic field showed localized distortions that did not correspond to any known geological feature. The distortions were not random. They were organized, arranged in a pattern that, when mapped, corresponded precisely to the outline of the buried structure as suggested by the original ground-penetrating radar data. Vance proposed, carefully and with extensive qualification, that the structure might not simply be transmitting a signal. It might be generating energy, producing something, electromagnetic output, acoustic resonance, some combination of physical effects, without any apparent external fuel source, continuously, for decades at minimum, possibly for far, far longer. He knew how this sounded. He said so explicitly in his notes. I am aware that this conclusion, stated plainly, sounds like science fiction. I have spent considerable effort trying to arrive at any other conclusion. I cannot. The data is what it is. The data was what it was, and the structure, whatever it was, had not stopped running. ACT-7, inside the mountain. Through a chain of connections that Vance would later describe only as a sequence of fortunate introductions, he gained access to something he had no official right to see, a set of deeper scan composites that had been produced during the classified phase of the investigation in the years following the original survey. The data had been compiled using more sophisticated equipment than the field team had carried, technology deployed by the successor operation that had taken over the site after the original team was extracted. The images were extraordinary. The outer geometry that the original team had detected, the pyramidal shape, the four faces, the converging apex, was confirmed and refined. But the deeper scans revealed something the original equipment had not been capable of showing. What was inside? There were chambers, multiple chambers, arranged at consistent intervals along the structure's vertical axis. Each chamber was roughly symmetrical in its own right. Between the chambers, the scans showed corridors, not passages in the rough organic sense that natural cave systems produce, but linear, precise, dimensionally consistent passages that connected the interior spaces in an organised way. And running through the centre of the entire structure, from somewhere near the base all the way to the apex, was a vertical shaft, a central column of space, perfectly aligned with the structure's axis, rising through everything. The outer shell of the structure, the material that the radar pulses were bouncing off of to produce these images, was something Vance could not identify. It was not stone in the conventional sense. The reflectivity profile was wrong. Stone of various types produces characteristic radar returns that experienced geophysicists learn to read the way musicians read sheet music. This material returned something different, denser, more uniform, with a reflectivity profile that suggested either an extremely unusual natural mineral composition or something that was not natural rock at all. Attempts had apparently been made during the classified phase to obtain physical samples. Drilling had been attempted at the surface above the structure's edge. The drill equipment had failed. Not in the sense that it encountered rock too hard to penetrate. Rock can always be penetrated given enough time and the right equipment. It failed in the sense that the equipment itself broke down in ways that the engineering team described as inexplicable. Components that should have lasted for weeks of continuous operation failed within hours. Multiple attempts produced the same results. Whatever the outer shell of the structure was made of, it did not want to be sampled. Act 8. The cover and the truth beneath it. The official position has never changed. According to every public record, every government statement, every response to every Freedom of Information request that has successfully made it through the processing system, there is nothing beneath the Alaskan interior near Denali that requires any particular explanation. The restricted airspace is environmental. The land access restrictions are precautionary. The monitoring activity in the region is routine. There is no pyramid. There is no signal. There is no structure. This is the narrative that has been maintained with remarkable consistency across multiple administrations, multiple agency reshuffles, multiple generational turnovers of personnel. The people who managed the secret in the 1990s are mostly retired or dead. The people managing it now, if it is still being actively managed, may not even know the full history of what they are guarding. Classification can become self-perpetuating. A restriction put in place for reasons that were urgent in one decade can persist into the next through sheer institutional inertia, maintained by people who follow the protocols without ever being told why the protocols exist. But there are threads, small ones, inconsistencies in the public record that only become visible when you look at enough of the surrounding context simultaneously. There is the matter of the airspace designation, which uses a regulatory category that is technically reserved for areas of active geological instability. an area that all publicly available geological surveys describe as among the most stable in the entire state. There is the matter of the monitoring budget allocation for the region, which is significantly higher than comparable regions with no known points of interest. There is the matter of a research permit denial from the early 2000s, in which the denial letter references ongoing scientific operations at the site, operations that have never been named, described, or publicly acknowledged. And there is the matter of the signal, which anyone with access to the right monitoring equipment and the right archived data can find if they know where to look. It has not been hidden. It has simply been left unexplained, which is almost the same thing, because most people do not look at raw seismic data, and the people who do are generally not looking for something that should not be there. Vance looked, and the signal looked back. Act 9, the direction of the signal. The final phase of Vance's investigation was the one that changed everything. He had spent years establishing that the signal existed, that it was structured, that it corresponded to a physical formation in the earth, and that the formation appeared to be actively generating something. All of that was extraordinary. But a buried structure generating a signal, however inexplicable, is still a local phenomenon. It is strange, but it is contained. It is a mystery with a boundary. What Vance found next had no boundary. He had been assuming, as anyone would, that the signal propagated outward in all directions from its source, the way a stone dropped in still water sends ripples in every direction equally. This is how most geological signals behave. This is how acoustic resonance works in stone. This is the expected physics of the situation. But when he mapped the actual propagation of the signal across the monitoring network, plotting the relative strength and timing of the signal at every station that had detected it, and working backward to reconstruct the directionality of its spread, the picture that emerged was not a circle, not a sphere, not an outward radial propagation. The signal was directional. It was not broadcasting equally in all directions. It was focused, aimed, like a beam rather than a broadcast. And when Vance traced those directional lines across the Earth's surface, extending them beyond the monitoring network, following their geometry across geography, he found that several of them terminated at points of extraordinary significance. The lines pointed to locations with ancient structures, monuments, sites of archaeological significance that span multiple cultures, multiple continents, multiple millennia, places that humanity has found remarkable for thousands of years without fully understanding why. Places built, according to the conventional historical record, by separate civilizations with no known contact with one another, and yet places that share, again and again, certain striking geometrical and astronomical properties. The signal from beneath Denali appeared to be reaching toward them. Vance was careful, in the way that scientists are careful when they know they're standing at the edge of something that cannot be unseen. He did not immediately conclude that the directionality was intentional. He spent months testing alternative hypotheses. Perhaps the apparent directionality was an artifact of the monitoring network's geometry, a statistical illusion produced by where the stations were placed rather than where the signal was actually going. He tested this by using subsets of stations in different configurations and running the propagation model again. The result was consistent every time. The directionality was real. Perhaps the signal was being refracted by geological features, shaped by the particular density and composition of the rock it was passing through, in the same way that light bends when it passes through water at an angle. He tested this by modelling the geological profile of the region and calculating what refraction effects would look like in the data. The modelled refraction did not match the observed directionality. The signal was going where it appeared to be going, not where the rock was sending it. And perhaps the coincidence of the terminal points was exactly that. Coincidence. Perhaps the lines drawn from the Denali signal simply happened to pass near sites of archaeological significance. The way lines drawn from any point on a globe will inevitably pass near something interesting if you extend them far enough across a planet as densely layered with human history as this one. Vance tested this too, running a statistical analysis that asked how likely it was, given a random set of directional lines from a random point, to intersect with sites of known significance at the rate he was observing. The probability was not zero, but it was very, very low. Low enough that the coincidence explanation required more faith than the alternative. ACE 10, the network. The theory that Vance developed at this stage of his research was the most ambitious and the most difficult to prove. It was also, he believed, the most important. He proposed that the Denali structure was not unique, that it was not an isolated anomaly, that buried beneath various points on the Earth's surface, points that might correspond to ancient sites, or to regions of unusual geological behaviour, or to areas that have attracted human reverence across centuries without any obvious explanation. There might be other structures, other nodes, other sources of that same low-frequency signal, each aimed, each directional, each connected to the others through a network whose architecture spanned the entire planet. The implications of this theory are difficult to process even in the abstract, because if it is correct, if the Denali structure is one node in a global network of buried structures, all of them communicating, all of them generating signals pointed at one another, then the question is not simply what they are. The question is what they are doing, what the network is for, what it is maintaining, or measuring, or transmitting. And perhaps most unsettling of all, who built it? Because whatever the timeline is, it does not fit neatly into any known chapter of human history. The structure beneath Denali sits beneath undisturbed permafrost that geological dating suggests has not been disturbed since the last ice age, the ice age that ended approximately 12,000 years ago. That is 6,000 years before the earliest known complex human civilization, 8,000 years before the first pyramid was constructed in Egypt, more than 10,000 years before any written historical record begins. If the structure was built, it was built by something or someone that we have no record of. No mythology adequate to contain, no framework to understand, and yet there it sits, patient, active, still running after all this time. Act 11, the 2012 activation. Vance's time series analysis of the signal's historical intensity revealed something else. It was not constant. The signal was strongest, most detectable, most clearly structured in its mathematical patterning during specific windows of time. Between those windows it did not disappear entirely, it merely quieted, retreated to a lower intensity that required sensitive equipment and careful filtering to detect at all. Then, at certain intervals, it surged again, not randomly, at intervals that, like the signal's own internal pattern, followed a structure rather than a chaos. The most recent major surge on record occurred in 2012. The significance of that year is not lost on anyone who remembers the cultural moment around it. 2012 was the year the ancient Mayan long count calendar completed a major cycle, an event that the popular imagination had attached an enormous amount of apocalyptic and mystical significance to. Predictions about the end of the world, or the dawn of a new age, or some fundamental shift in cosmic or human affairs, filled books and films and news cycles. Most of it was sensationalism built on misunderstanding. The Mayan calendar cycle ended and the next one began and nothing dramatic happened. And yet, 2012 was also a year of elevated electromagnetic activity globally. Solar activity during that period was high, producing geomagnetic events that affected satellite systems and power grids in various regions. Atmospheric phenomena were recorded at unusual frequencies in certain latitudes, and across the network of geophysical monitoring stations that Vance had been using to track the Denali signal, multiple anomalous readings were logged within a 6-week window, centred on the December solstice of that year. The Denali signal during this period was the strongest it had been in the entire available record, more precisely structured, more clearly directional, more coherent in its mathematical patterning than at any other point Vance could identify. It was as though something had woken up, or more accurately, as though something that was always awake had for a period raised its voice, and then quieted again, back to the baseline, back to the patient, low, rhythmic pulse that had been there all along, waiting for whatever comes next. Act 12. What the mountain knows. There is something almost meditative about sitting with a mystery this large and this old and this thoroughly unresolved. Most mysteries, given enough time and enough investigation, yield. They have edges. They have answers somewhere in them, even if those answers are difficult to reach. They are puzzles, and puzzles have solutions. This does not feel like a puzzle. This feels like something older than puzzles. Something that existed before the categories we use to understand the world were invented. Before science and religion and history and mythology, all the different languages humanity has developed for describing what it cannot immediately explain, were available to reach for. Whatever sits beneath the Alaskan interior does not care about our categories. It is not waiting for us to classify it correctly. It is not holding its secrets as a challenge for us to overcome. It exists on its own timeline, operating according to its own logic, doing whatever it has been doing since long before the first human being looked up at the stars and wondered what they were. The mountain above it, Denali, the Great One, the High One, has been standing for millions of years. Long before any human eye saw it. Long before any culture gave it a name. The rock and ice of it have weathered everything. Ice ages and warm periods and tectonic shifts and the slow, geological revolution of a planet in constant motion. It will still be there long after every city humanity has ever built has been erased by the same geological processes that shaped it. And beneath it, something pulses, something measures, something waits. The question that keeps returning, the one that Vance returned to again and again in his notes, the one that sits at the bottom of this entire story like a stone you cannot quite lift, is not what the structure is. It is not when it was built or what it is made of or how it generates its signal without any fuel source we can identify. The question is simpler than all of that, and harder. What is it for? Act 13. The people who know not everyone involved in the story of the Denali structure is a scientist or a bureaucrat or a theorist sitting at a desk with access to archived data. Some of the most interesting pieces of this puzzle come from an entirely different direction. From the people who have lived near the mountain for longer than any government agency, any monitoring station, any geophysical research project has existed. The Athabascan peoples of interior Alaska have inhabited the region surrounding Denali for thousands of years. Their relationship with the mountain is not the relationship of the tourist, or the climber, or the scientist. It is ancestral, embedded, passed down through generations in the form of story and song and ceremony, and a kind of intimate geographical knowledge that develops when people live in relationship with a landscape over centuries, rather than simply passing through it. In the oral traditions of various Athabascan groups, there are stories about the mountain that do not fit neatly into the categories of legend or folklore, as the Western tradition uses those words. Stories about a presence beneath the mountain, about a sound that certain places emit in certain conditions, a low, almost felt rather than heard vibration that elders have described in ways that, when translated, sound remarkably like what the seismic monitoring stations recorded. About the mountain as something more than geological, something with purpose, something that existed before the people arrived and that will continue after they are gone. These traditions were not developed in response to the 1992 monitoring anomaly. They predate it by generations. They predate any contact with Western scientific culture. They are older than the monitoring equipment, older than the research stations, older than the state of Alaska itself. And they describe something beneath the mountain that has always been there. Something that pulses, something that connects, something that, in the words of one elder's account as recorded by an anthropologist in the 1970s, breathes on a schedule that is not ours. The scientists arrived in 1992 and found a signal. The Athabascan people had been living alongside that signal for millennia. They did not need instruments to detect it. They had simply learned to understand it as part of the world, a feature of the landscape as natural, in its own way, as the river's current and the seasonal migration of animals and the long, tilting dance of the sun across the Alaskan sky. Whether that makes the structure more explicable or less is a question worth sitting with. Act 14. The Architecture of Concealment. Every large secret requires maintenance. It does not maintain itself. Someone has to renew the access restrictions each year. Someone has to process the freedom of information denials. Someone has to ensure that the monitoring budget continues to flow without attracting scrutiny. Someone has to keep the airspace designation current. Someone has to know enough to keep knowing what they need to know, while ensuring that no one else knows more than they need to. The architecture of concealment around the Denali site, if the theories are correct, has now been in place for over 3 decades. 3 decades during which the technology for independent geological investigation has advanced dramatically. 3 decades during which satellite imaging has become sophisticated enough to detect surface anomalies in remote terrain that would have been completely invisible to earlier generations. 3 decades during which ground-penetrating radar technology has advanced to the point where commercial applications can achieve what classified military equipment could barely manage in the early 1990s. The question this raises is a practical one. How does a secret this large stay secret this long? The cynical answer is that most people are not looking. The region near Denali is vast, remote, cold, and inaccessible. The restricted designation is boring enough that it generates no press attention. The monitoring data is esoteric enough that only specialists can read it, and specialists are, as a professional class, generally disinclined to publish findings that would make them look like they have abandoned the norms of their field. The freedom of information system is slow enough and complex enough that most requests simply exhaust the patience of the people making them before they produce anything useful. The more interesting answer is that perhaps the secret does not need active maintenance. Perhaps it has reached a kind of self-sustaining equilibrium in which the sheer strangeness of what is being concealed is itself the best protection. Because how do you report this? How do you stand in front of a scientific conference or a congressional hearing or a press briefing and say, there is a pyramid beneath Alaska, it is bigger than Giza, it has been generating a mathematical signal for as long as we have had instruments to detect it, and we believe it is communicating with similar structures at other points around the globe? You do not say that, not because it is false necessarily, but because the moment you say it, the response consumes you. The ridicule, the scrutiny, the institutional pressure, the professional consequences, the sheer weight of how impossible it sounds pressing down on everything you have spent a career building, and so the signal pulses on. And the mountain keeps its secret, and the world goes about its ordinary business in the ordinary way of worlds that do not yet know what they are sitting on top of. Asset 15. The timeline that doesn't match ours. If you step back from the individual details of this story, the signal, the scans, the classified documents, the drilling failures, the directional beam, the 2012 surge, and look at the whole of it from a distance, what you see is something that is troubling in a very specific way. Everything in this story operates on a timeline that does not correspond to human timescales. Human institutions, even the most durable ones, change over decades. Governments shift, agencies are restructured, personnel turn over, scientific paradigms evolve. The things that seemed certain in one generation become the objects of revision in the next. Nothing in human culture stays the same for a century without significant transformation. This is the nature of civilization. Dynamic, adaptive, impermanent in its specifics, even when it manages continuity in its broad outlines. The structure beneath Denali has been doing the same thing, in the same place, at the same coordinates, producing the same signal, for a period of time that dwarfs anything in human institutional memory. The earliest geological evidence suggests the structure has been there since before recorded history began. The signal Vance detected was not changing. It was not evolving or degrading or shifting its character the way a human technology would after thousands of years of operation. It was doing now what it had apparently been doing at the beginning, pulsing in its mathematical rhythm, aiming its signal at its network of distant points, maintaining whatever function it serves with complete and utter indifference to the human world that had grown up around and above it. This is what separates the Denali structure theory from more conventional conspiracy theories. Most conspiracies are about human actors concealing human things for human reasons. This is something different. This is a conspiracy that, even if the concealment is entirely human, is concealing something that may have nothing to do with humanity at all. something that preceded us, something that will outlast us, something that is running on a schedule so much longer than ours that our entire recorded history might be, from its perspective, a brief afternoon. Consider what 12,000 years actually means. 12,000 years ago there were no cities on Earth, no writing systems, no agriculture in any meaningful, organised sense. Human beings were still hunter-gatherers, moving through landscapes that looked very different from the ones they inhabit today. The Sahara, which is now among the driest and most inhospitable places on the planet, was a savanna, green and wet and full of life. The coastlines of every continent were shaped differently, because sea levels were lower, because so much water was still locked in glaciers that have since melted. The world was a different world, and in that world, that Ice Age world of migrating herds and retreating glaciers and coastlines that modern maps would not recognise, something built a pyramid beneath what would eventually become Alaska. Something designed it with a geometry so precise that our instruments, measuring it through hundreds of feet of intervening rock 12,000 years later, still cannot find the error in its angles. Something installed within it whatever mechanism produces the signal that is still pulsing right now as you listen to this. Something aimed that signal at specific points on a globe that the something presumably understood. A globe that human beings would not achieve a complete picture of for another 11,500 years. Whatever built the Denali structure understood the shape of the Earth before we did. It understood mathematics before we named it. It understood the technology of signal transmission and directional communication while we were still carving tools from stone. And it built something intended to last, not for decades, not for centuries, but apparently for geological timescales, for the kind of duration that makes human civilization look like a footnote. And still it pulses. Still the mountain breathes on its schedule. Still the signal reaches outward across the surface of the world to touch whatever it has always been touching, doing whatever it has always been doing in the cold and dark beneath the Alaskan ice. Epilogue. The mountain below. Today, the region near Denali remains what it has been for decades, restricted, monitored, and officially unremarkable. Hikers who venture into the wilderness surrounding the mountain see what has always been there, the vast, indifferent beauty of a landscape that does not need human witnesses to be extraordinary. The sky above it is sometimes so clear and so dark that the stars seem close enough to touch. The silence in that place is the kind of silence that has mass, that you can feel pressing against you, that makes the ordinary noise of the human world seem, from inside it, like something from another dimension entirely. Beneath that silence, if the theory is correct, something is still running. Not loudly, not dramatically. With the same patient mathematical rhythm it has maintained for longer than our civilization has existed. A heartbeat in stone and permafrost and whatever material it is made of that our drills could not penetrate and our instruments could not fully identify. A heartbeat aimed at specific points across the face of the earth. A heartbeat that surges occasionally, as though something in the deep machinery of its function requires a moment of heightened activity before settling again into its baseline. It's waiting. There are things in this world, and perhaps beneath it, that are genuinely beyond our current capacity to explain, not because the explanations do not exist, but because we do not yet have the framework to hold them. The history of human understanding is, in many ways, the history of slowly developing frameworks adequate to contain what was always already there. We did not invent gravity. We noticed it, named it, and eventually developed the mathematics to describe it. The stars did not begin existing when we built the first telescope. We simply found a way to see them more clearly. Whatever sits beneath Denali has been there, if it is there, since long before any human telescope or seismograph or ground-penetrating radar existed to notice it. It does not require our attention to function. It does not need our understanding to continue doing whatever it does. It simply is, buried and patient and active and unknowable in the way that truly ancient things are unknowable, not because they are hiding, but because the depth of what they are exceeds for now, the depth of what we are able to see. The mountain keeps its secret. The signal continues, and somewhere, in a filing cabinet or a classified server, or the memory of a retired scientist who signed a non-disclosure agreement decades ago, the truth of what was found beneath the Alaskan ice sits waiting for the moment when the right person with the right access finally decides to let it out. Or perhaps that moment has already passed. Perhaps the decision has already been made by someone we will never know, in a room we will never see, to simply let it remain buried. To let the mountain breathe its quiet, mathematical breath forever. To let whatever is down there continue its ancient work in peace. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and some things beneath the earth, some signals pulsing in the dark beneath the oldest mountains in North America, perhaps they are better left as questions, as mysteries, as the kind of story that you carry with you into the night and into sleep, and into whatever the mind does when the ordinary world releases its hold. Buried beneath the coldest ground on earth, something is still running. It ran before we arrived. It will run after we are gone. And in the long silence between the pulse and the next pulse, it does not wonder what we think of it. It simply waits, and the mountain breathes, and the night, as always, goes on.